Now I know what you're thinking. What kind of a name is Super Chinese World 2? Was there a Super Chinese World 1? Well, yeah, actually. It was this fucking game. Remember this? So, way back in 2020, I reviewed Super Ninja Boy. And to this day, I think it is the worst game that I've reviewed in this entire series. And I'm not being hyperbolic. Basically what it was is it was this unholy mishmash of a platformer, a beat 'em up, and an RPG. Sounds cool, right? Only no, it sucks because it is the cheapest, palest imitations of all three of those genres that you could possibly imagine. The platforming was so bad that they actually included a way to skip all of those parts. The RPG elements are the most basic on the entire system, and the beat 'em up just plain old wasn't fun.
In other words, it sucked. But it didn't suck in a vacuum. Culture Brain, the company which made these games, believe it or not, consider this their flagship series. And no, they don't exist anymore. At least I don't think they do. Their company website is hawking a $5 3DS game, and there aren't anything credited to them since 2017. Might sound recent, but remember, 2017 was 7 years ago. And if you dig a little deeper, there were 0 listed between 2017 and 2001, so it's likely that whatever this Culture Brain is with the 3DS games has very little to do with the original, and was just revived as a brand name to attached to some shovelware. Anyway, they were an active developer in the NES and SNES days, perhaps most known for Baseball Simulator. But it's the Super Chinese series that we're focusing on, which began with Kung Fu Heroes, of all titles. I didn't know that. You've probably at least seen this game before, because it was one of the first things released for the NES, and as a result did bizarrely well despite being absolutely horrendous. This game is not fun in any way. Don't believe me? Well, it's on Switch Online, so try it out for yourself. Next came Little Ninja Brothers, which totally ripped off the Donkey Kong font, and this is where the series started to round into a familiar shape. It's part basic RPG, part beat 'em up. From what little I played, it seemed acceptable. Ironically, combat was much more responsive than its Super Nintendo incarnation. There was another sequel on Famicom, which never left Japan, that looks like more of the same. Then finally we get to the infamous Super Ninja Boy, a spruced up, but only slightly, rendition of the NES game. If you can stomach it, go back and watch my ancient review on that. It sucked, though apparently did well enough to justify 2 direct sequels, but not well enough for either one of those to leave Japan. When I did the original, these both remained untranslated, but in 2021, DDS Translation decided to localize the whole series, and as a result, laymen like me are finally able to play these crappy games.
Okay, but enough stalling. You know why Super Chinese 2 is, but now let's find out what Super Chinese World 2 is.
Game begins with a cutscene that lasts way too long for what the plot of this ends up being. You're forced to watch a fake fight you have no control over. Lots of text, but the gist is there's an evil empire and you have to collect the 6 crystal shards to stop them. There's nothing original going on here. The wrinkle is that instead of staying in China, you go to outer space and different planets. Then our spaceship lands on the first planet overworld, and the graphics are a little better than Super Ninja Boy. A bit basic, but not too bad. I mean, I can work with this. But then we get into a fight, and first impressions, it somehow feels even worse to control. I don't know how they managed to pull this off, but the whole thing is so choppy and stiff. I mean, I guess it doesn't feel any worse than something like Double Dragon on NES, but are those the standards we're setting for ourselves here? A flawed early last-gen port? You don't begin the game with any special moves or anything, so you just have to punch away until your enemies eventually die, or they suddenly vanish into a poof of smoke, that is. This is how the last game worked too. It's incredibly strange. If you're in a battle with 3 enemies, you don't just beat those 3 guys up. When you defeat one, another runs in from off-screen to take its place, and you just have to keep killing people until they all magically vanish. The game is weirdly inconsistent about about this. Sometimes battles end after killing one guy, but other times you're stuck here for a while. Still in the first impressions stage, I went into the first town I came across, and already my pet peeve alarm is going absolutely bonkers. This is going to be the most petty nitpick ever, but it's also indicative of the entire game. Did you notice it? No? Okay, well, when you first enter any area, the game spawns you in wherever the hell it wants. Think about any top-down traditionally styled RPG overworld. Final Fantasy II, for instance. When you enter a town, you start on the first tile on the edge, maybe one up. But in Super Chinese 2, they placed us on the 5th space up? Why? This is a weird inconsistency everywhere. We never start on the edge of the map. It's always some weird tile a random number of spaces away from the edge. I know. This doesn't really matter per se. In the grand scheme of things, does this really affect the gameplay? No, but it's this lack of attention to detail that runs through every orifice. For example, the whole planet hopping motif, the idea is that instead of traveling from town to town like a normal game to do your Odyssey quests of the day, you're going from planet to planet instead. But at some point they ran out of time or got lazy because the first few you travel to are fairly fleshed out. Multiple locations, many different dungeons and platforming gauntlets. Then they get progressively less complex as the game goes on. And I can actually demonstrate this visually because somebody bothered to rip the maps from this game. Okay, here is the first planet. Looks solid, right? No complaints so far. Then the next, well, okay, I mean, they don't all have to be huge, right? Sure, it's made up of exactly the same tiles as the first planet, but, you know, a little simple spin-off planet with a couple little islands is fine. I'm not gonna harp on this too bad. And 2 examples don't exactly make a pattern, so let's move on. See, the third planet is looking fairly meaty already. We've bounced back. Lots of places to go, lots of things to see. All right, let's see the fourth. Oh, this is it? It's just one town with the shortest, saddest made dungeon in history? It's not even an overworld. You enter the planet and it's just one town. All right, let's move on to the 5th. Again, what? Really, it's just one town? And there's not even a dungeon attached to this place. What the hell? Next? Okay, what is going on here? Again, no overworld? And this one pathetic cave is supposed to be a dungeon or something? What the heck are they doing? We were going from full-sized planets to now just singular areas. And there's no cohesion either, by the way. You enter this door inside of a cave and end up in this wide open town, no cave in sight. These areas don't gel at all. They don't look like one leads into the other. The game has completely given up on each planet being its own unique thing with its own quest. They made 2 distinct ones, which, not that there's anything wrong with that. Phantasy Star, for example, only has 3 planets, but if you can't commit to the gimmick of going from planet to planet to planet, then don't do it. These should have all just been places you visit on one of the perfectly good planets they already constructed. It feels lame when you establish a precedent that you're going to do a couple hours of questing on one planet, then you're going to move on to the next one, and then that's going to be a whole new overworld with stuff to do. To then, in the second half of the game, cheapen out and not include overworlds and just send you directly to a town. That is stupid as hell, and just reeks of cheapness. The whole game feels budget. It still uses password saves, which is pathetic for a Super Nintendo title. Ironically, the text is probably a lot better than it has any right to be because fan translations in 2021 are of a much higher quality than some cheaply done professional jobs by no-name companies in 1993. Hell, some of the big boys hadn't even figured out localization yet by then. The text itself is fine, but every single dialogue scene apart from the intro and ending take place on this abstract Super Chinese grid with static character portraits. Nobody's mouth moves or anything. There's no cool effects. It's all just words next to a face. It's one of those games that would be about 4 hours long as opposed to the 11:31 it actually took if you weren't forced to grind often for the first half. Don't let the beat 'em up format fool you. Your ability to win these fights has very very little to do with your actual skill and everything to do with your stats, which are raised by, you know, the normal things, equipment upgrades and levels. Super Chinese World 2 is absolutely something where when you finished with one area, you're nowhere near strong enough for the next, so random encounters it is for you until you are. That is at least until you get the electrified Bug Zapper sword, at which point you can stun lock every single enemy in the game, including the final boss. Kinda cool, but you don't get it until almost the end. The enemy balancing is like they didn't even try. Not only are the difference between enemies from one section of the game to the other too high, as I just said, but they'll vary wildly within the same area. Sometimes I would be in situations where one set of mobs I kill in one hit, and another in the same location refuse to die no matter how many times I knock them down. Sometimes you get lucky and the battle arena contains a pool of water you can trick enemies to falling into, in which cases you can destroy anything regardless of level and nothing matters. The encounter rate is abhorrent. As often as any other game I've played, up there with something like Shin Megami Tensei 1. You can't reliably take more than 5 to 10 steps or so without getting into another fight. Even when you get a vehicle, like this fancy looking boat, fuck off. God damn, instantly. Why can't you just let me have some fun? Getting a boat in these games is supposed to be a triumphant moment, but the encounter rate is even worse inside of it here, because they didn't adjust for the speed. Let's say a game is programmed to have a 15% chance every time you take a step to initiate a random battle. At regular walking speed, this might be fine, but when you enter a vehicle and you're traversing over spaces at a much higher rate, even if the distance traveled ends up being the same before fights, it feels like you get into way more because you're getting into them faster. This is a phenomenon I've witnessed in countless games now, and you can always tell when they don't adjust the random encounter rate for vehicles. This battle system doesn't feel thought out either, because super early on, I'm talking before you even get the first MacGuffin, they introduce a transformation where all you have to do is hold Y and press select, and you enter what the game calls Hyper Chinese mode. It makes your sprites bigger, you move faster, you hit harder, and there is no drawback to this whatsoever. There is no reason for you to ever not want to be in this mode. It doesn't drain resources. All it does is deplete this meter next to your health at the top of the screen. But guess what? All you have to do is enter Hyper Chinese mode again and it refills. This is stupid. Why not just start in Hyper Chinese mode? Why have a needless timer if all I'm gonna do is transform right back immediately? Why is there even an option to fight normally? The only reason I would ever not transform are when the enemies are so weak that I don't care. Any real battle, 100% of the time, begins with you holding Y and hitting select because it makes you stronger and there's no reason to not do it. This isn't even half-baked. They forgot to turn the dang oven on. It feels like an ability lopped on, like they didn't consider what its purpose would be. No, I know the point. The point was to keep little kids who can't figure out something as complex as hitting the select button from being able to finish the game. That's why it was included. The platforming is exactly how I remember it being in Super Ninja Boy, only here there's no dragon egg which allows you to skip through them. They suck, but you also don't have to do nearly as much of it in this game. In fact, I believe only one platforming stage, located inside of the final dungeon, is required to finish it, where every other area just leads to equipment upgrades. They minimized it in a different way here. They're a fun little bonus. Well, fun in air quotes. Because they're still fucking awful. Your movement is stiffer than Castlevania NES, and the stages are not designed in a way to compensate for that. They're all auto-scrollers, which inherently sucks because it means that there's no way to speed through these, and if you die, you have to painstakingly do it all over again, and you gotta wait for the screen, and it It just sucks. Platforming is not fun, but at least you can avoid most of it in Super Chinese too. Oh, here's another nitpick. When you die, instead of going back to the last inn you rested at, you go back to the last time you viewed the password screen. Weird. I adjusted pretty quickly, but naturally you're not going to see the password nearly as much as you rest at the inn, so it's a little inconvenient. I really shouldn't complain because a more dastardly game would have kicked you back to the main menu, which thankfully this never does. It's not all terrible, I suppose. Some of the dialogue is entertaining in an absurdist way. Like this woman who asks if I want to have a butt battle with a beautiful babe.
Well, lady, I mean, I won't complain.
Or the king of this place proclaiming that everyone should live the rest of their lives naked. And you know, I think this guy might be onto something. It's all nonsensical. I don't know if I'd go as far as to call the dialogue funny, but it's definitely silly and a bit charming. Super Chinese World 2 is a slightly beefed up Super Ninja Boy. It suffers from all of the same problems, but everything is just a little shinier. The graphics are improved, the fan translation results in some entertaining NPC lines from time to time, but at its core, it's still horrible. I know every game has fans, so if you happen to be a Super Ninja Boy fan, then here is more of the same. Also worth noting that it's 2-player co-op, so if you just finished Secret of Mana and you want another SNES RPG to play with a friend, here's another option. The game ends with an ominous warning. To be continued in Super Chinese World 3. So they already knew they were crapping out another one, but if you allow the ending screen to sit there long enough, the game gives you a password to restart the game at max level. It takes a few minutes, and I was lucky enough that I didn't immediately turn the game off and happen to be writing some notes. Lucky in air quotes, not like I'm ever gonna play this again, but you watching the video, feel free to swipe this code and start at level 50 if you don't want to grind. Well, the video's not done yet. On to the follow-up. Almost. Before they got to 3, Culture Brain released Super Chinese Fighter, a Street Fighter-esque one-on-one fighting game based on characters from this universe. I hate that I know who all of these people are now. I don't know very much about fighting games, I just know that I sucked at this one. Tried a few matches and couldn't beat anyone. It defo feels much better to handle than the combat sections from the main series, but it's still so stiff. They showed me a move list, but I couldn't get my gal to do any of them. Ugh. I'd rather play Shaq Fu. So after making basically the same game twice in a row, for Super Chinese World 3, they decided to offer something a little bit different. Before entering a new save, you're given the choice between an action RPG or a turn-based RPG. Interesting. Action retains the same combat system from the rest of the series, but turn-based is exactly what it sounds like. Instead of being part beat 'em up, you can just turn this into a pure RPG, which is what I chose, just for the sake of something different. And as expected, it's like a completely different game now. 3 also doesn't have any platforming segments either, so we've gone from a genre mishmash to a traditionally Dragon Quest style JRPG. And you know what? It's nothing too deep or complex, but I like it a little bit more. Graphics are basically the same. You can tell this was a quick turnaround. Hell, they were already working on it when the last game came out, as indicated by the ending. All the music is completely reused, and cutscenes are still on this separate screen with the character portraits, only now the background moves. Woo, I guess. All the criticisms I levied against 2 about the cheapness also apply to 3. There's still no cohesion from area to area. For example, this abrupt scene change. And worst of all, it still uses password saves. I'm sorry, that was just me gagging. But I can't say I'm surprised. The gimmick this time, instead of hopping from planet to planet stopping the evil empire, you're traveling from dimension to dimension to stop the evil empire. Only really makes a difference in text. Doesn't change anything about the game. But they did learn their lesson about stretching out the concept further than their resources can handle, because there's only 3 separate dimensions, and each of them are as fleshed out as you'd expect them to be. I'm pleasantly surprised. I wouldn't call this game good, but it's a noticeable step up from the other 2. I mean, look at this. Your airship is a giant robot. That's cool as hell. And they learn their lesson again, because you don't get into random encounters while you're inside of it either. So this just rules. Balancing is improved too. For most of the game, I didn't have to grind at all. It felt like I was at the proper level to take care of whatever was in front of me. Chinese World 2 felt padded to hell, but this one I was constantly put in new environments with new silly little quests to get the MacGuffins. I felt like I was making genuine progress the entire time I was playing, with the exception of one huge asterisk. See, I beat this entire game in one day. It took me 9 hours and 32 minutes, but I reached the final boss at 6 hours 51. Yeah, this was one of the easiest games I had played until all of a sudden it wasn't. The final boss is a brick wall because you have to do him one-on-one as opposed to having two party members out at the same time. He's the only enemy in the entire game that's allowed to move more than once per turn. And isn't that cheap when a game does this, where all of a sudden there's an enemy that can move 2 times instead of once? Yeah, that would be cheap if he could move 2 times, but it's not as cheap as what they actually did, because he goes 5 fucking times. For every 1 move you get, he gets 5. Wow. Honestly, I would have respected it more if they just tuned up the numbers to an insane degree, instead of letting him attack 5 times. That is the only reason this fight is difficult at all, and it forces you to stop dead in your tracks and grind until you're finally strong enough to withstand all of these attacks. So that's what I did. I walked back and forth fighting random enemies for about 2.5 hours, challenged the final boss again, and barely squeaked out a win. But other than that, no real complaints here. Super Chinese 3 is not the worst game in the world, but I don't know if I can really recommend it for anyone either. Instead of a failed beat 'em up, now we have a generic cookie-cutter turn-based RPG. It's fine, give it a pass. And that was it for the Super Chinese lineage. They put 2 more fighting games out for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, called it a series, then called it a company. I guess these didn't do well enough to save Culture Brain. On the NES as a one-off, it's a cute little thing, but then they tried to stretch this property out much further than it had any right to. When they adapted Little Ninja Brothers to the SNES with Super Ninja Boy, it was laughably outclassed. To then sequelize such an underwhelming game, well, I mean, I got pretty much what I expected. Anyway, that's all I got. Shout out to the patrons. Shout out to William Robert Lee. Never trust anyone who needs a haircut. Goodbye.